Design.
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 Design means to plan.
Human.
Substance.
Technology.
Designing for a better future.
What is design really?
Let's talk about design.
Making an impact in the world.
The power of design to improve life.
Design to survive.
Stephen Hawking was one of the world's most brilliant minds, revered for his tremendous accolades and fondly remembered for his trademark voice. Created back in the 80s by Dennis Klatt, a pioneer in speech synthesis, Hawking's voice, named Perfect Paul, became an icon.
I have not allowed my disability to stop me doing most things.
Just like Hawking, millions of people today don't have the ability to physically speak due to illness or injury. And if they're fortunate enough, use communication devices to type into a keyboard or even use their eyes to have their words transformed into computer-generated speech.
Bonjour, mon nom est Chloé. Secours utilise
My
le
name is
son.
James. Please turn up your computer's volume to hear my voice.
Though we often forget, our voices are one of the most critical components of who we are. They not only serve the fundamental purpose of communication, but are defining parts of our identities, tools for creative expression, and help us form emotional bonds with friends, family, and even complete strangers. Whether you're a baritone, fast talker,
is that okay? Did you get everything you need?
Mumbler,
but he abandoned his family and his baby daughter to do it.
Or have a voice that's instantly loved or loathed, you have a distinct way of conversing with the world, just like you might warm to or feel repelled by my Australian accent as I try to clearly articulate each word of this story. But when it comes to restoring this damaged or lost human function, we rarely consider the importance of individuality. In essence, we use the best technology to give people the power to communicate, but we almost never give them a voice of their own.
Each one of us has a unique voice print that reflects our age, our size, even our lifestyle and personality. In the words of the poet Longfellow, the human voice is the organ of the soul.
When Hawking received his new voice, it was a groundbreaking moment in history. But even American-sounding Perfect Paul wasn't such a perfect fit at the time for a British Hawking. And now, more than 40 years later, sadly, not much has changed for most of those who suffer from speechlessness. Today, millions of individuals are still speaking with a limited collection of computerized voices that bear no resemblance to who they are. But is it possible to give them back this critical piece of their identity? Welcome to Can Design Save Us, a series exploring design as a pioneering force for good. We dive into the most pressing problems of our time and meet people using design to solve them. We explore the good, bad, complex, and controversial. My name is Leslie Price, host from the Index Project, and my guest today is speech scientist and pioneer Rupal Patel, founder of Vocal ID, a voice AI company that creates bespoke synthetic voices, giving those living with speechlessness a voice that's uniquely theirs. Thanks so much, Rupal, for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Leslie. Thank you for having me.
So you've been working in speech for such a long time. What initially drew you to the field?
You know, I accidentally found speech and speech science. I really didn't know about the field very much until late in my undergrad. So I was a neuropsychology major and really interested in more in the lines of sort of the brain and potentially medicine, not really my wish, but my parents' wish. And then when I learned about speech-language pathology and speech science, I became fascinated with both the science of it as well as the human connection in terms of how you can better people's lives. And so it was quite a hook, but it wasn't until later in life.
Mm-hmm. And Vocal ID, that came as a spin-out from your university project, right? Research.
That's right, yeah. Vocal ID was a research project before it was a company.
And it's such a brilliant story about how, I guess it was your aha moment, you would say, about you were speaking at a conference. And I'll let you tell the story.
Yeah, so, in my PhD, I studied how people with very severe speech disorder can control their voice. And I was presenting some of this work back in 2002 at a conference in Denmark. And, what I had found in the research that we had done was that people with very severe speech disorder can still control certain aspects of their voice, even if they're not fully understood. There's something that makes them unique. And sort of right after giving that research talk, I walked into the exhibit hall of this conference where there's a lot of vendors displaying the kind of technologies that people have to use if they can't use natural speech as their main method of communication. And what I observed was a young girl and a grown man having a conversation using their assistive devices. Different devices, but the same voice. And to me, that was sort of the aha moment of seeing that, well, if the research is showing that they have unique aspects of their voice, why are we giving them the same sort of box to speak through? And so that was the beginning of, the seed was planted, and from there, the research began, actually not until a couple of years later.
But that's crazy. I mean, back in 2002, and I didn't realize the conference was in Denmark, did you say?
That's right. It was in Odense.
Oh, okay, there we go. Nice little connection there.
Yeah.
So as you guys mentioned that for Vocal ID, you guys can create these synthetic voices in just hours as opposed to months. How is it that you can do that?
Yeah, so what has happened in the last couple of decades in the research in speech synthesis is that there are new methodologies to build synthetic voices today than there have been in the past. So if you think about the Siri voice or the Alexa voice, some of these voices that you're accustomed to hearing today, they're built using a technology called concatenative speech synthesis. So concatenative speech synthesis means that you're gluing together little bits of speech and recombining them when you need to produce novel text that wasn't said by the voice talent. So you actually have a voice talent record hours of audio and then all the sounds and sound combinations, and then you kind of find the right bits when you have to create new and novel text into audio. And that's really labor intensive and time consuming. And in the last few decades, there have been advances in different methods of speech synthesis called machine learning based synthesis or deep learning synthesis methodologies. And here it's different. You still start with human actors recording speech, but now rather than actually gluing together recordings or WAV files and recombining them, what you're doing is teaching the machine through this data how to speak or emulate someone's speech. Mm-hmm. And so it's very different. It's kind of creating almost like a mathematical equation of the speech and then using that equation again when you want to generate new audio. So sort of simplistic version of that. So when you do that, you actually can now create synthetic speech rather quickly and with much less audio than we've had to in the past. So we've been able to leverage that. And we've also been able to leverage some of the breakthroughs that we had in our laboratory of how to combine or create a voice for someone who has very little speech motor control. Mm-hmm. In this case, what we call bespoke voices. So the person who's unable to speak but can still vocalize makes some sounds. We take that sound or vocalization and we look for someone in our voice bank, people who have banked their voice or recorded their voice with us, to find a close match. And we take all the recordings of that close match and the person who can't speak, that's a match, and we morph those utterances together and then use that data to train the synthetic voice model. So that is why we can create voices so rapidly and also with such little data.
Mm-hmm. You also had another brilliant I guess I'm not sure if you would call it a product, but where it is about helping people preserve their voices. So, for example, there was a story in The Guardian I read that was about a gentleman called Joe Morris that had cancer in his tongue and he had to have most of it removed. So he knew it was coming. So how do you guys help people preserve their voice and be able to use it after they're no longer able to?
Yeah, that's a great question, Leslie. So, when we first started, bespoke voices were really our focus because that hadn't been done before. It was so novel. Yet to create a voice for someone who had banked their voice was relatively, that's the process. That's how you make a speech synthesizer. But making that available to someone who's about to lose their voice, it was not really worked on as much. So even though it wasn't sort of novel, what we were able to do with Vocal ID is have a very simple user interface for someone who is losing their voice, just from the comfort of their own home with a headset microphone that's, a few dollars, to use that to record their own speech, and then from there we can recreate their synthetic voice. And so that's what we did for Joe, and for many others who already have an inclination or know that they're about to lose their voice from, let's say, conditions like head and neck cancer or degenerative diseases such as ALS or Parkinson's disease. And, what was now possible today, you and I are, talking over oceans with, over Zoom or over these technologies. And our phones also have become so much better at collecting data. Technology to record data is ubiquitous today. And it wasn't as easy and it wasn't as comfortable for lay people to do that maybe even 10, 15 years ago. So the moment is kind of interesting. It's not so much brilliant sort of innovations as it is timing and the fact about this ubiquity of technology.
And if someone wants to donate their voice, what is it like? What's the process like? Would you guys give me a script and then I would go into a booth and sort of read, is it as simple as reading a script? When I say simple, of course, it's not very simple. It's much more complicated, but I'd love to hear the process.
Yeah, we've had tens of thousands of people record on our Human Voice Bank platform. The Human Voice Bank is a virtual recording studio. And here people who are volunteering their voice for those in need record somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 sentences over the course of several days. And the scripts are provided for you. And they're actually organized now in a series of stories. So you have some choices in terms of the kinds of things you want to read about, whether you want to read about science and technology or whether you want to read about poetry or literature or whatever. So you get some choices. And then these scripts appear on your screen, kind of almost like a teleprompter, line by line, and you're asked to read them aloud. If you make a mistake, you can re-record and so on. And so we've had kids as young as 6 years of age, and people all the way up to 91 who may not be the most proficient at using a computer record their voice on the platform. So people from actually 120 countries from around the world. So it's amazing the kind of global reach that we've been able to have by creating a very simple user interface to get people to record and share their voice.
I mean, who writes these scripts? I feel like you said, it is poetry and stories, but I feel like it would be quite difficult to get the sort of uplit intonation, the questions and everything. How does that work? Or can you sort of cover it, or do you have to use tech to sort of add the small details?
Well, there's a little bit of both. So as long as you have enough data, you're able to sort of have enough coverage. The one thing we've been doing through some of the grants we've been getting is actually trying to figure out what is that, if we're only going to get half an hour of someone's time, what do we give them first?
Yeah,
how do we front load that, right? And that's where a lot of our research has actually gone into, is trying to figure out what kind of content we need. It's a little different with these machine learning methodologies. When we first started, we were actually using that gluing together technique, concatenative speech synthesis. And there we had to be very careful that we got the right intonation patterns, we got the right sound combinations and all of that. In these new methods, these machine learning methods, you still need coverage, but they're actually pretty good at interpolating in between as well. But data is really the key thing here, how to get the right data. And so we're doing some of that work, but also trying to get enough coverage. We also have to make sure that people are interested in reading what they're reading. So if we just give them, in our first rendition of the Voice Bank, we kind of had just given them 3,000 sentences, piecemeal from different stories and so on.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, it wasn't the most interesting. And you lost people after 200 to 300 sentences. It's like, well, what is this? It makes no sense.
They sound very excited at the beginning and then they slowly get more and more fatigued as they go.
Right.
Okay.
And we can't keep their attention and so on. And so it's basically a trade-off game of how can we get enough data and also good data, expressive data. So all of these things are their parameters that we're constantly evolving on in terms of the research that we're doing.
Another interesting point that you've mentioned before was about making these more accessible to people. So these are essentially a lot cheaper than a lot of the technologies to give people sort of, their unique voice. What's the price point at this stage, if I can ask?
Yeah. So vocal ID voices are actually available for $1,499 US. We can do this because we've got some funding from government research contracts that allow us to kind of bring this technology to those who need it. Now, before we started Vocal ID, the company, there's really very little effort was happening. There's some research labs that were doing, voice preservation, but sort of at scale to provide a product to someone who wanted a bespoke voice was never done before. And so voice actors had, of course, recorded their voice. You'd think about Susan Bennett, the voice of Siri, had recorded her voice, but obviously the voice wasn't available for $1,400. And the techniques were really expensive. And so what we've been trying to do, and there now actually are multiple other companies that are also trying to service these markets. But I would say the key thing here is making sure that we're bringing the newest advances in these technologies to people with speech disabilities. It's sometimes tricky to do that because their devices and the technology and the hardware that they have to use for communication is not always the cutting edge. But that's one of the commitments we've made at Vocal ID, is that we want to continue to bring the best technology as possible to these individuals, and to make sure that that's at the forefront of what we're trying to push for.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you remember, I'm sure you remember, the first time that you gave someone their voice? I can imagine it would have been an incredible experience. Can you sort of walk us through what that was like or what you observed?
Absolutely. I mean, I remember so many of the firsts, to be honest. There's our first year that we were essentially giving or sort of creating the voices for people who couldn't speak was in 2015 within the company. I mean, we'd done some of this research in the laboratory, but in 2015, we decided we were going to do 7 voices. And those 7 voices at the end of the year were going to be hand delivered. And we had different techniques because they were their first that we were delivering.
And were those 7 voices over... like, for example, a young girl and then an older gentleman? What were if you can recall what the 7 voices were?
Yeah, they were a number of younger sort of teenagers or young children. There was also, most of them are actually younger people who had been born with disabilities where they weren't able to speak. Most of my research has been with people with cerebral palsy. And so that's been a keen interest of mine. And so most of the cohort was that. They weren't very young, but I think the youngest was a 9-10-year-old girl, Maeve. And then we also had a gentleman who had lost his voice to ALS. And in this case, this gentleman, actually John, who is the gentleman who had lost his voice to ALS, he and his wife Linda were part of the impetus for me to start the company. Because after I gave my TED Talk, I had a lot of emails come in and say, well, where can I get these bespoke voices? Or they weren't even called bespoke voices at the time. Where can I get a Vocal ID voice? Also, Maeve and her sister, Erin, who had also reached out to me. I had an email from a 12-year-old girl saying, I would love to be a voice donor for my sister who speaks with a talking device. Now, it was one of these things where I had never intended to actually commercialize this. At that point, it was just research. But a lot of this kind of interest led me to say, well, if people are willing to contribute their voice, and we had so many volunteers after the TED Talk was released, and also when it went live, to say people were saying, oh, I volunteer my voice. And we thought that was part of the hard problem. And as soon as that became sort of this unlock, we thought, wow, we could really do this. And so when we first delivered these voices, some of the magical moments was the time that Maeve and her sister sort of gathered around for the delivery of Maeve's voice. And we try not to tell people whose voice is being used to create their voice, because we don't, it often can cause all sorts of issues. And in this case, she had 2 sisters who had both contributed their voice, and we didn't want to cause any more sibling rivalry. Sibling rivalry is not something that we intended on creating more of. So that was a magical moment, because everyone was just so excited to hear her voice, and they wanted a voice that belonged to herself, like to Maeve herself, as opposed to feeling like it was just like one of the other sisters. And so, yet still in the family. That was a big moment.
I feel excited. I want to say hi to Taylor Swift with my new voice.
The other was when we delivered our voice to the voice to John. So for all of these early adopters, we had built sort of 3 models of the voices as we were sort of perfecting our creation process. So we played the first couple to John and his wife, and they politely kind of shook their heads and kind of said, "Yeah, that's pretty good."
Just a nod, yeah.
Yeah, sort of nods. The last voice that we played, as soon as it played, we could see the sort of this very emotional rush on John's face, and his whole body actually started to shake. And we weren't sure if that meant that it was something wrong or something. But Linda's face also just showed almost like they were hearing something again for the first time. And this is a couple who has done so much for ALS. They're continuing to have a foundation and all of these things. And so they've become really close to us at Vocal ID, and we wanted to help. We wanted to really make sure that they were happy with the voice. And what we heard them say is that, they finally heard him again, because they had actually lost all the audio tapes of his, or audio recordings of his voice, because when they traded in his cell phone for his iPad, because he needed that to communicate now, they had lost the voicemail messages on there. So they didn't have a record of even what we were trying to recreate for him.
Could you get any of his voice in there, or was it completely from donor voices? Okay, so you could.
No, we could get his voice. So he still had some vocalization, but it wasn't clear anymore. But the hardest thing was, it was very raspy. By the time we were trying to build this voice, it was no longer the voice he really had, right? And so it's very different when you're trying to push air through the vocal tract when you have very little control over it. You'll generate some sound, but that sound is not the strong sound of who he was when he was doing his work earlier. He was a businessman who did a lot of talking, and and that was the thing that it's hard to replicate.
But it's so fascinating that you were able to create it to receive that response, and so closely that, that's just incredible. And how long had he been without his voice?
I would say about 2 to 3 years by that time. If I could maybe... This is not necessarily a story, because you're asking about stories, Leslie, and I think that stories sometimes
No,
really...
go for it. I'm happy to go on a tangent, please.
Yeah, so I think stories are really the way that this technology comes to life, because it's really touching people. I recall one gentleman who had read about Vocal ID's technology literally 20 hours before he was going to have part of his tongue and his entire voice box removed. And the way he learned about it is that his father had seen a story about us on an airline magazine.
Wow.
And his father was rippling through the magazine and saw this and said to his son, who was in his, probably 50s or 60s, there's this technology. And he was an astrophysicist, I believe, and, used his voice a lot to talk and so on. And so he called us, he called me on my cell.
Less than a day.
And that was the number that was somehow associated with the company. And we started talking, and he said to me, "I just learned about you. What can I do? How can I save my voice?" And when I recognized he was only going to have 20 hours, I first started with we're going to have to go the bespoke way. You're going to have to make some vocalizations. Please record those, and so on. And he said, sure. He was really afraid. He just didn't know what to expect, right? So he said, fine, and he was going to go get the equipment, and we were going to check on the recordings a little bit later. Then I hung up, and I just sort of talked to my team. We just had a quick meeting, and I said, well, what can we do? Is there a possibility that we can, what will happen if we can record 1,100 sentences or 1,000 sentences? Could we use that? And so one of the engineers basically said, well, what's the harm in trying? So let's do it, right?
Yeah.
So I called him back, and I said, okay, once you have your microphone, we're going to actually see if you can record more. If you can record more, maybe we can make it sound more like you, right? Actually take your recordings.
Yeah, so it's a legacy, yep.
Yeah, and that day, I still recall so clearly. This gentleman, he got on, he started recording. Every half an hour or so, we were constantly monitoring his audio, making sure it was good audio, giving him feedback. It was 10 p.m. at night that night. So I talked to him, I think 9 or 10 in the morning. At 10 p.m. at night, he needed to go to bed. He was having surgery the next morning, and he was a little sort of tired. And at one point, he sent me an email and said, I think he'd gotten to 1,300. How many more do I need to do And what difference is it going to make? In fact, he had said, what's the delta going to be? So you're such a scientist. And I said, well, do what you can, but really the important thing is that we need a rested voice. And so if you're tired, we don't want to capture that anymore. You've done what you can, and I think we're going to be going with it. So I feel like people often think of voice preservation as, well, someone else will do it, or I'll just mix my voice with someone else's voice. And what happens for those from the stories we've been hearing who are in the position of losing their voice, there is nothing more valuable than having their own voice. And that's true for them, and it's also true for their loved ones. I mean, so many spouses, even after their loved one passes of these disorders, want to continue to use their vocal ID voices as a way to connect with their loved one. It's that powerful. I know it's not an exact replica, and the technology will just keep getting better and better and better, but it's better than nothing. It's better than having nothing where you can't. Recordings, obviously, you can listen to, but when you can generate something novel to say, like even the I love yous or whatever else, I think we're not quite used to thinking about what that means today. Like how would we use something like this?
It's very hard to relate to unless you're in that position, right?
Absolutely. Or you think, well, is that, sometimes when I say this, people say, was that kind of creepy to have your spouse's wife and and your spouse's wife, to have your spouse's voice and to be able to like make it say something? I think it's very hard to put yourself in someone's shoes when you're grieving and what the importance of that voice does for social connection.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I'm actually quite interested. So if you are to go to a dinner party and explain what you do, is it often that people's only point of reference is Stephen Hawking, or how have you seen that sort of evolve over the time?
Yeah, so it used to be. I mean, I think for people's understanding and association with synthetic voice, maybe a decade ago or so, was very limited. But today, we hear synthetic voice really all around us. And we hear different qualities of synthetic voice. So we'll hear sort of very poor quality synthetic voice at the ATM or the parking garage or something like that. And we'll hear high-end synthetic voice in the sense of Siri and Alexa and so on, right? So we've got this range. But still, when you say synthetic, there is a little bit of the sense of, ooh, that's not quite real.
People automatically think it sounds very robotic, right? Well, yeah, they think of Stephen Hawking's voice. Perfect.
Exactly. But when you think of Siri's voice, I mean, she's not exactly non-robotic, but it's come a long ways from that technology. And also, I think these newer methodologies, when you start thinking about cases of, deep fakes and deep audio, which are now much more real than they were in the past, you can see that there's a very real evolution of this technology. So there's, I think people know what it is, but they don't quite know how fast it's evolving right in front of our ears.
In front of our ears, I like that. But because speech synthesis has been around since the 50s, if I read correctly, but there hasn't been a lot of innovation in the field. Do you think it's because now we only have the technology, or do you think it's also because when we talk about restoration of any human function, it's always based on functionality? We often think very much, we don't really think about the individual aspect of it. Sort of, what's your view on that?
Well, speech synthesis has been around for even before the 1950s. Speech synthesis in the digital realm before that. But, for centuries, I mean, way back in the 1700s even, scientists were creating speech with mechanical devices like bellows and all sorts of things to replicate the human structure. And you then have someone playing almost like an organ to create the different sounds, right? So there's this famous machine by Faber that was called Euphonia. And so I think that there's been a fascination with recreating speech for a long, long time. And you're right, though, that for the last few decades, prior to this last, couple of decades, there's been kind of almost like a plateauing of what speech synthesis technology has done. And I think that's now rapidly changing. But the reason I think is because as soon as we'd gotten to a place where we could understand, like the metric for is a speech synthesizer good enough or not is something called intelligibility. if you listen to a sample, how many words do you get right, or how many sounds do you miss in the synthesizer, right? So that's a measure of intelligibility. How clear and understandable is it? And there were two measures. One was intelligibility, and the other was a mean score of sort of likeliness or naturalness. These two scores were really the only two scores that were used to judge whether a synthetic voice was getting better and better. But one thing that was completely missed is, does it emote anything? Does it really express anything, right? I mean, you kind of capture that naturalness, but most people would give a speech synthesizer somewhere between a 3 and a 4 on naturalness because it's not fully human sounding. Well, that doesn't really help because now you have no way of differentiating which is better than the other. It's sort of all fall in the same bucket. So I think today there's a few reasons for why we are now starting to see a resurgence. One is of research in this area. One is the fact that voice has become a predominant method of interaction. As more and more information is being created constantly around us, our eyes cannot consume information as fast, right? Because there's only limited space on a screen to put visual information. And so now we have to start using other modalities to get information to us. And there's been in the last decade or so this massive increase to go from reading content with our eyeballs to listening to content with our ears.
Hence why we're doing a podcast right now.
Exactly. I mean, this would have probably been an article, right? 10 years ago, this would have been an article. It would have been a magazine article or an article on the web or whatever, or it would have been a video. Right? It wouldn't have been a podcast. So podcasts and all these new audio streaming channels are creating a desire and an appetite for audio. And what happens too is there's a lot of devices now that have the capability to talk and to listen. And so when you start seeing, it's kind of just like people, right? At some point, the reason we all have different voices because we needed to differentiate who's talking, and we needed to figure out sort of where that voice is coming from. Sort of similarly with objects and applications that talk to us, we no longer can afford to have the same voice or voices that don't sound clear coming from all these things that are talking to us. And so there is an investment into making those voices sound unique and understandable and natural and all this. And so I think it's a confluence of a bunch of different things for why we're thinking about this. But oftentimes with language and speech, functional is sort of the first bar. And then as you get adoption at grand scale, then the next piece is let's start to do the things that really make us human in terms of communication, which is the inflections and the variety, which frankly we just don't have today.
Definitely. I saw another video of you. It was a very simple analogy, and it's that you wouldn't wear an ill-fitting prosthetic, right? So it's like, why would you have a voice that isn't you at all? It makes so much sense.
And that's true for individuals, but it's also true for companies, right? If you're a company and your brand has, an ordering application or a customer service application where it's going to speak to your customers, you better not sound like your competitors,
right?
Because that's going to be quite. You have to invest in voice as a strategy.
Where do you see this tech heading? Previously, we talked about you had a very interesting application where it was similar to a wearable. Or do you think eventually we won't have the smartphones that we're sort of typing into or the devices that it'll essentially be? Could it be a brain-computer interface? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of very exciting research that's happening in the field of assistive communication. I've been involved with one project where they're developing some sensors that you put on the surface of the face and the neck in order to perceive the small muscular activities. From there, you can take mouthed speech, for example, not audible speech, but just mouthed speech, and translate that into text, and then from text, translate that into voice through something like Vocal ID. And now you're going to go from, just mouth speech all the way to audible speech. For those who have lost their voice to cancer, for example, that's actually a really it's a very seamless prosthesis, right? They don't have to type and then, because they have all the control of their vocal articulators, they just no longer have their voice box. And so I think that there's some really interesting ideas out there about how we can have these new technologies. They're still not market ready quite yet, but it's coming. I mean, it's advanced quite a bit in the last few years. The other, of course, is brain-computer interfaces, as you mentioned. But I think that my take is it's a lot farther. I'm sure researchers in brain-computer interfaces will tell you that it's a lot closer. But really, speech is a complex motor act. And to get signals from the surface of the brain and translate them into thoughts and to think that there's such localization in the brain is a pretty simplistic version of how the brain works.
Yeah, I can imagine. I would love to hear about, on the flip side, that tech has enabled so much, but then it's also got this very dark side, particularly when we talk about, replicating humans, deepfakes, for example. And I know this is something you're concerned about as well, which you're one of the founding members of AI Ethos, and then a coalition of companies focused on ethics. Can you tell us a bit about what you guys are striving for, or at least maybe trying to prevent?
Sure. Yeah, so Ethos is a synthetic media consortium. So it's many companies that are interested in building or are building synthetic media, whether that is visual or audible. So voice conversion, voice synthesis, also computer vision technologies out there. And what we are set up to doing is preventing or at least educating those who are using our technologies in making sure that they don't get misrepresented. And also taking the proactive steps to make sure that we, as designers and creators of this technology, are foreseeing and actually proactively doing things in order to make sure that our technology doesn't get misused. Every new technology, regardless of what it is, whether it's biochemical, digital, will always get misused somewhere or the other. But I think rather than sort of waiting for something to happen and then saying, okay, we'll clean up this mess, our goal here is to say we can foresee this. We've already foreseen this. We've seen this in social media. We've seen this in digital media. We've seen this in deepfakes and so on and so forth, that we have to think about doing this proactively. So it's a really important piece. Many of us are actually working on technological solutions, but that alone is not enough. Another part of the solution is actually educating the public, as well as other companies, other consumers of our technologies, to understand how there could potentially be breaches. And so very important, I think, to be at the forefront of this rather than trying to sort of fix things as they come up.
Definitely. You had a great story that a bank actually approached you guys, right? And said, can you crack the voice code? Is that correct? Yeah,
so we had worked with, a couple of years ago, we'd worked with a major bank in order to see if we could penetrate through their voice authentication systems. Many of us are now using banking applications where we can speak, our voice is our password. And the idea was, could we build a synthetic voice on someone from very limited audio and then use that to break through? And, I think one of the challenges there is that it's true that our synthetic voices may not be able to fool a human, but many times they can, in fact, fool machines that are listening for synthetic speech, primarily because these new methodologies are so good at emulating speech that it's hard to create machines that will stop that. Yeah. So that was kind of the first impetus for us. But then could you crack the code? Well, or yes. But maybe you can't share it, Well, with some, depending on how much data you have, you can. Also, though, there are 2-3 factor authentications that are often used in conjunction. And so if you were just listening to voice, you could crack and get through. But most of these larger enterprises don't just have voice as the method of entry. And so that's kind of why we have 2-factor authentication and multiple factor authentication processes in place. I think if the fraud level for voice, synthetic voice media was higher, we'd certainly be, I think that company would be using a lot more of our technologies than it is today. Let's just say that. Yeah, you guys mentioned that you went to a few banks and then they said they won't worry about it now, but this could be something they're concerned about in the future. Yeah. And I think that that's, I think we are very much in the early stages of voice technology and sort of emulating voice technologies as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is that sort of the biggest fear for you guys that, I guess Vocal ID could land, or the technology would be landing in the wrong hands? I can imagine it's quite, just with any of these technologies, it's quite difficult to sort of control them. It's like I like the analogy of someone used, it's like trying to corner a greased up pig. I don't know if you've heard that analogy.
I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, that it is so difficult to control. I mean, is it, would you suggest that it is just being very proactive as a new company to try to avoid this as opposed to damage control afterwards?
Absolutely. And I think, it's interesting. So when we started the company in 2014, there's fewer smaller synthetic voice companies. Now there's more. And I think the idea is it's not going away. Synthetic voice is here, and it's going to get better and better. And so rather than kind of saying, well, this whole industry is going to disappear, or, that people are just going to stop using it because they're too afraid. Well, there are also all these good implications of this technology. And so I think we just have to start thinking about how do we protect against that? What can we do in the audio signals itself? Can we embed watermarks? Can we, there are multiple ways in which we can prevent that, the misuse of the technology. And I think we have to use all of those methodologies, from standards to technological, solutions as well. The other thing too is that as the public understands more, and you can start doing things like having ways to detect this from a human perspective, you can avoid the things that happen as a ripple effect in terms of it's not just a human. So it's not just a machine solution. There is a human-machine collaborative in preventing this. So what I mean by that is it's not enough to just say all of this will be solved by technology. I think much of this is going to have to be solved by both technology and humans together in order to prevent these kinds of things. The other thing too is, synthetic speech today has come a long ways, but yet one of the places where it sort of continues to have issues is, how do you make it, you and I can change our voice for what we mean, and we can do things like make a voice sound sarcastic. I'm hesitating right now as I'm communicating because I'm sort of formulating my thoughts as I'm talking.
Yeah.
That is not what a machine knows how to do. Right? Yeah. So you put text in, you get text out, and there are no variations in pitch and intonation and pausing. That's actually what makes you and I human sounding, whereas it's going to need a human orchestrator to kind of get that quality of audio. So it's not like pressing a button, out comes awesome audio, and bam, you're ready to go. So I think even today, the machine does about 80 to 90% of the work, or the algorithms, and then there's still humans in the loop, whether they're voice casting directors or they're talent themselves or audio engineers, but there have to be humans in the loop to make this technology really sing, and not sing necessarily, but production ready.
Very poetic there, pun intended. So what's next for Vocal ID? I checked out on the website and I was really impressed to see that there was an Australian accent there. Are you guys looking to go into other languages? Or, I can imagine you've got your work cut out for you even within the English language with so many regions and everything like that.
Yeah, so we're sticking to English for the most part right now. We are starting to work with companies that want a unique brand voice and different kinds of differentiation. Also regionally and locally. So even in the US, if you think about it, there's very different speaking styles from the South to the West, or North and South, and so on. And so there's a lot of differentiation there, of course, across continents and in the English-speaking areas of the world. And so we're focusing there for now. We are starting to work a little bit on some other languages, for example, in Spanish, but it's really challenging to kind of too many languages at once, because each language, each culture, even regionalization. Yeah,
the dialects and everything. Yeah, I can imagine it's a huge project.
Exactly.
But, it's so exciting. I'm Yeah, I just love the project. Anyway, I think that's all we have time for, RuPaul. But thank you so much for your time. It's been really, really interesting. And it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Leslie. It's been so much fun for the Index Award to feature us and talk about this. So I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Can Design Save Us by the Index Project. I'm your host, Leslie Price, and this episode was produced by Cecil Ko Noaga, with music by Christina Dillisko. Join us for the next episode, where we dive into AI and healthcare.